the United States, many people feared, was becoming a nation of lawbreakers. And we would hear the same sorts of complaints again with the arrival of rock and roll in the 1950s, and then with the arrival of rap in the 1980s.
On January 16, 1920, the 18th Amendment to the Constitution made the manufacture or sale of alcoholic beverages illegal nationwide. This culminated a crusade that had begun 100 years earlier. And at first, Americans did indeed drink less. But the noble experiment quickly broke down. More and more people began to break the law, drinking alcohol provided by booming crime syndicates. As Will Rogers said, Mississippians will vote for prohibition as long as they can stagger to the polls. The open flaunting of prohibition and the association of the commercial nightlife with crime and immorality hardened growing divisions in American society. In fact, the 1920s revolution in manners and morals was limited in its scope. The majority of Americans remained traditionalists, God-fearing Protestants who held on to small-town values and watched with growing fear and condemnation what they saw as the erosion of traditional values and morality. World War I had also unleashed Anglo-Americans' fear of foreigners, giving rise to hostility and violence against people different than themselves. A revived Ku Klux Klan accused American Catholics, now more than one-third of all Americans, of placing their allegiance to the Pope above that of their country. Jews, the Klan charged, dominated motion pictures, popular music, and bootlegging, using all three to promote sex and violence.
If this state of affair continues, the American race is doomed to cultural destruction. Against us are all the forces of the mixed alliance composed of alienism, Romanism, hyphenism, Bolshevism, and un-Americanism, which aim to use this country as a dumping ground for the fermented races of the old world. Imperial Wizard Hiram Wesley Evans.
The Ku Klux Klan had tremendous appeal to many Protestant Americans in the nation's heartland, especially the Midwest. By 1923, the Klan controlled 3 state governments and claimed 5 million members. During the 1920s, Congress passed a series of new laws that severely restricted the number of immigrants entering the United States from Europe and virtually banned immigrants from Asia. The river of Europeans who had poured into the nation for decades was reduced to a small stream. The laws, however, said nothing about the Western Hemisphere. During the 1920s, 500,000 Mexicans would pour into the United States to work on the farms and fields of California and the Southwest. While nativists waged their war against ethnic Americans, evangelical groups denounced the materialism, hedonism, and godlessness of the urban United States. The nation was splitting in two, engaging in a war of cultures that would last the decade. In the summer of 1925, this war of cultures witnessed one of its most memorable battles in the small town of Dayton, Tennessee. Alarmed by the challenges of modern science to the Bible, the Tennessee legislature had passed a law outlawing the teaching of evolution in the state schools. When high school teacher John Scopes taught evolution anyway, he was arrested and tried. 3-time presidential candidate William Jennings Bryan argued for the state. Scopes was represented by Clarence Darrow, the nation's most famous defense lawyer. Under intense national press coverage, the monkey trial, as it became known, dragged on through the hot days of July. In the end, Scopes was convicted, but Darrow's withering cross-examination of Bryan made the fundamentalists look foolish, widening the gap between America's two cultures. 1926 provided another test of strength between the traditionalists and the modernists, this time in a boxing match between Jack Dempsey and Gene Tunney for the heavyweight championship of the world. As part of the nation's 150th birthday party, the city of Philadelphia hosted the biggest sporting event in American history.
Jack Dempsey was the most popular heavyweight of all time. He came out of the West. He was a natural fighter, a brawler. He was a Protestant fundamentalist. He represented small-town traditional American values. His opponent, Gene Tunney, was an Irish Catholic. He was a New York City slicker who married a debutante and who read Shakespeare while he trained for the match. Here you have a clear clash of cultures. Not in a courtroom or in a presidential election, but right there in the boxing ring, man to man. The first bout is disputed, but goes to Tunney. Second bout, Tunney beats Dempsey again. The modernists come out triumphant, at least in sports.
The 1920s were the golden age of sports. There was Bill Tilden in tennis and Bobby Jones in golf. There was the galloping ghost, Red Grange, whose bursts of speed attracted spectators to college football and then to the new sport of professional football. And towering above them all was the Sultan of SWAT, the great Babe Ruth. His soaring home runs on the field and huge appetites off the field so well represented the extravagances of the Roaring Twenties. The greatest of all the heroes of the decade was an unassuming farm boy who burst upon the American imagination from out of the western skies in 1927. No one had ever flown non-stop across the Atlantic Ocean until Charles Lindbergh landed in Paris on May 21st, 1927. And he had done it alone. Lucky Lindy became an instant celebrity and the hero of the age. In an age of ballyhoo image and hype, here was the real thing. Courageous, handsome, resourceful, the living embodiment of the greatness of the American people and technology. Man and machine working as one to master the skies and restore the nation's faith in itself. Heroes like Babe Ruth and Lucky Lindy helped create that sense of belonging lost in the culture wars of the 1920s. Another thing that most Americans had in common was their belief that capitalism was bringing about a better world.
The chief business of the American people is business. The man who builds a factory builds a temple. The man who works there worships there. President Calvin Coolidge.
President Coolidge's now famous words indicate the almost religious faith that many Americans placed in business. The gospel of business told Americans of all backgrounds that prosperity would bring about fulfillment of the American dream. But the prosperity of the 1920s rested on weak foundations. The growing concentration of wealth into fewer and fewer hands, cutbacks in industrial production, and a binge in speculative investments were laying the groundwork for catastrophe. When the stock market crashed in October of 1929, the party was over. They didn't know it at the time, but Americans were witnessing the start of what would become the worst and most prolonged economic depression in the nation's history.